Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capital Dateline. I'm your host, Brad Swanson. We're here just a few blocks from Florida's capital, which is about ready to start a special session. We are once again joined by Jim Saunders, the executive editor of the News Service of Florida, to give us the insights as to what's happening inside the Capitol and what we're going to expect for the upcoming session. Jim, welcome.
Thanks.
All right, so Governor, the Speaker, and the President all got together last week and announced the special session. So is there a deal? What's in, you know? Has there been work ahead of time?
I think there's a deal, okay. Yeah. I mean, we all knew that there probably was going to be a special session sometime this month to get the budget situated, and because there were so many differences when they came out of the regular session. We kind of knew there was going to be a special session. I think a lot of us were surprised how fast it's happening. Right. All of a sudden, Friday morning, they hold a press conference at the Miami airport to announce this deal, and then say that the special session is going to start this Wednesday. Right. So which means it's going to move pretty fast, and that the deal has been cut. So, you know, everybody gets a little bit of what they want in this deal, basically. I mean, the governor's been wanting money for business and economic development types of issues.
Visit Florida, Enterprise Florida.
Visit Florida, Enterprise Florida. But, you know, and part of this deal is that there would be $76 million for Visit Florida for tourism marketing. That is what the governor wanted at the beginning of session. He later said, well, I want $100 million. But the legislature in the budget they passed, you know, during the regular session, only put $25 million into Visit Florida. Right. So he gets a $50 million bump there just in Visit Florida itself. Also, this deal includes $85 million for what they're calling a new Florida Growth Grant Fund, I think, or some name like that. And essentially, it would be to provide money for infrastructure and job training types of initiatives. Now, this would probably be to help draw businesses.
Right, but Speaker Corcoran throughout the entire legislative session had been really the leading voice against government incentives. How is this different?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, at this point, the outline is a little bit still, I think the details still have to be filled in, at least for public consumption. What the Speaker was against adamantly for months and months, and he went to war with the governor over it, was giving money to Enterprise Florida to provide business incentives, flat out business incentives, to try to draw corporations here. But the governor asked for about $85 million. I mean, these numbers are not fiction. They didn't come out of thin air. They are, you know, they kind of match up with what was talked about earlier. So, you know, the Speaker's office was very aggressive on Friday, saying this is not business incentives for Enterprise Florida. This $85 million is going into a fund that's going to have all sorts of restrictions on how it can be used for public projects, infrastructure, job training, but it's not business incentives.
Right, because it'll always be owned by the state, ostensibly.
Right, I mean, that's you know, it's not direct payments to, or you know, types of payments or credits and those sorts of things to businesses that would be direct incentives. That's the Speaker's office position. So, but you know, I tend to think we're going to have to see how this plays out over time. I mean, you know, if you go out and build roads and provide job training to draw a corporation here, you're expending public money to help bring a company here. So, I mean, again, at this point, it's a little bit early to tell, for me at least, how this is going to play out over time. But, you know, I think the governor's got to be pretty happy. Yeah. He got a lot of money for Visit Florida that he wasn't going to get otherwise. He got this fund, so it, you know, it at least does part of what he wants to help draw businesses.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Enterprise Florida board stopped their board meeting and watched the press conference live, and when they announced the new package, rounds of applause happened. I mean, are they the only group that are happy about this, or does this extend to the entire economic development community? What are we looking at?
Well, I think, you know, I think definitely the tourism industry would be happy with all this. Yes. You know, again, I think there's a lot of questions about how this fund is going to work, but But the tourism industry, I think, would be very happy because, again, like I said, the governor went into the session asking for $76 million for Visit Florida, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Visit Florida's president and CEO also was just.
I heard that he was celebrating
a bullion, yes.
I heard that.
Yes.
So I think that probably the economic development community, the tourism community, is going to come away from this pretty, at least relieved. They may not have gotten everything they wanted, but it's a lot better than what was in the original budget for them. The other thing that was sort of a key part of this is education. The original budget that was passed provided very little funding on a per student level increase for public schools. They have found $215 million to put into that formula, which essentially will lead to a $100 per student increase. Nice round figure, for public schools. So, I think that politically is probably a win for all three, the House, the Senate, and the governor, because they were taking a lot of heat from the education community about, there's just not much money in this budget for, so they've found money for that. And, something that isn't laid out specifically in this deal, but I think everybody assumes this is what it is that, Senate President Joe Negron is focused very heavily on a bill that makes changes in the higher ed system. That looks like it's gonna stay intact, his priority. Also, Speaker Corcoran has another education bill, which has been kind of controversial. It includes charter school issues.
Funds and allocations.
Funds and allocations. And that looks like, the governor was sort of hemming and hawing about that on Friday, but I tend to think that was just strategy, to make sure that they pass his economic development stuff, then he'll sign off on the education bill. So, each of them kind of gets their priorities, and that's kind of how the deal get done. Right. It was all done in private. We don't know, how it was all put together, but that's sort of what came out of it.
So the governor also announced that he was going to veto a large chunk of the budget. So what did you see in those vetoes? What did that tell you?
Well, there's roughly $410 million in projects vetoed, which is a large amount. I mean, it's one of the larger amounts since he's been in office, and it's really one of the larger amounts that governors have done in recent years. But I think it's pretty clear that that's how they're funding some of these other things. I mean, they came up with $215 million for public schools, and but a lot of these projects there's a lot of university system projects. There's also just projects scattered throughout the state. It's not so unusual for a governor to target some of these. Now, maybe he did more than they ordinarily do, but it frees up money for them to fund their other priorities, which I think is the most important part of that. Now, obviously, there's going to be people all over the state unhappy that their projects got vetoed, including legislators, a lot of legislators. But I think that's what the play was here, was to free up money. And, if you take a few million here and a few million there, it adds up after a while.
Right, I mean, after a while, you're talking about some real money, right?
Exactly.
So let's talk about what's in the call and what's out. There's everybody and their dog catcher anytime there's a call for a special session that says, oh, but let's sneak our issue in. But medical marijuana certainly was one of those humongous issues. It's one we're hearing buzz about. It's not in the call now, but does it make it, and what other issues are vying for
it is not in the call, medical marijuana, but I think there's a chance that it will make it by the end of the week. The House and the Senate negotiated throughout the regular session, trying to reach a deal to carry out the constitutional amendment that broadly legalized medical marijuana. They couldn't reach a deal. They kind of kept going back and forth ever since. But this may be their only opportunity to pass legislation this year on it. Bill Galvano, who's a senator, a very influential senator who's been working this issue for the Senate, told one of our reporters on Friday, if we don't get it done next week, what good does it do to try to come back 2 months from now? If we can't get it done now, we're not going to probably get it done. So there's an opportunity there, and I felt all along, and I think other people have, that they can cut a deal on this if they really want to. And so I think that's a possibility. It's not a definite. I mean, they couldn't come to agreement over 2 months, so maybe they can over 3 or 4 days. But that is I think if anything's going to be added to the session, that would be it.
That would be the one.
There's clamor from some of the education people who oppose Corcoran's bill, they're still trying to ramp up pressure to get the governor to veto that bill, which wouldn't be something that would be added to session, but still that's an issue that's out there. I don't think it's going to happen. There was some discussion on Friday about adding workers' comp. One of the business groups, NFIB, sent out a release saying, we need action on workers' comp, which is another issue that couldn't get resolved during the regular session.
Well, it's 3 days, not another 3 weeks.
Well, and workers' comp, you open the can of worms, it just goes on and on forever. So unless they would have a deal on that, I cannot, it's a little bit hard for me to imagine that they would add that to this session. I mean, they're already getting pushback because of the way this deal was cut. So I have a feeling they're not going to want to open up another really murky issue like workers' comp, which would really could lead to a lot more controversy. But, I mean, we don't know for sure at this point.
All right, well, let's talk about one of the big bills the governor did sign, which is the Triumph Coast bill. I mean, that you're talking about big dollars, $1.5 billion infused into the Gulf Coast as a result of the oil spill, Deep Horizon. What's going on? Is the governor doing the victory lap as they do with stuff like that? Where is he?
Well, this is a big issue out in the Panhandle, and essentially what it amounts to is, Florida's getting all this money from BP, the BP settlement from Deepwater Horizon, and the question has been, how will this money be distributed, essentially? And there was some controversy during session about how do you sort of draw this up so that there's 8 counties that were most affected by the Deepwater spill, and how do you what do you allow them to use money for? How much money do you give them? How do you get it out to them? And in the end, the legislature reached a deal on this, and the governor signed it on Friday, and he is out, it's Monday, he's out in Panama City and Pensacola doing a victory lap. I mean, this is a big deal out there. It's going to be large infusions of money they can use for different kinds of economic type, infrastructure, those sorts of things. And, a lot of the business community, particularly in the government agencies out there, I think have been watching this issue pretty closely because it is millions of dollars coming to Franklin County is a big deal. So, and not to mention some of the more populated counties, but so there's 8 counties out there that are going to benefit from this. So I think a lot of them are relieved too that a deal did get reached.
Right. Well, there's many more bills sitting on the governor's desk waiting to be signed.
Yeah, another big one on Friday was a real high-profile one, was creating memorials and reburials for the victims of the Dozier Reform School out in Marianna. That got a lot of attention during session, and I think everybody kind of rallied around that bill there's a lot of bad stuff happened out there over the years, and the state's kind of trying to make amends for it a little bit. That was probably the other biggest bill that was signed last week.
Yeah, it was big, and I mean, you're talking about formal state apologies and beyond the recompense and whatnot. All right, so let's move on to the election cycle, right? So you have former Senator Jeremy Ring.
Because session's almost done.
Right, we're almost there, former Senator Jeremy Ring just threw his hat into the CFO's race. Who else is in that race?
Well, at this point, he is it, but we obviously know that'll change. But yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk for quite a while that Jeremy Ring was going to run for CFO. He's been kind of making his way around the state. He's probably not very well known outside Broward County, where he's from. He served 10 years in the Senate. He was actually, Democrats don't have a lot of influence in the legislature a lot of times, but he actually he had some leadership roles. He was the chairman of a committee that worked a lot of pension issues, some of those nuts and bolts issues that are really important, though they're not maybe the sexiest issues. But, he also is a former internet Yahoo executive, and he's a multimillionaire, so he has some money he can probably put into the race. But at this point, he is the only declared candidate. The big thing to watch is that State Chief Financial Officer Jeff Atwater is going to be leaving that job probably in the next couple of weeks, I would think, now that the budget looks like it's done. And he's going to be taking a job at Florida Atlantic University. And the governor's going to appoint a successor to him to fill out his term until next year. And I think that'll drive a lot of political calculations about who else gets in that race.
Right.
I mean, if it is someone who is very politically skilled and ambitious and wants to run again in 2018, they will have that power of incumbency going into that,
right.
essentially have that power of incumbency going into that election, which could scare off some other people.
Right. What names are you hearing?
Well, I mean, we've heard Jack Latvala, the Senate Appropriations Chairman. Senator Tom Lee has been out there at various times.
For it before,
He's run for it before. There's been talk about Carlos Lopez Quintero. There's also been talk that the governor might appoint someone who is not real political and be sort of a placeholder, if you will, until that 2018 election. But the governor's not tipped his hand at all.
Right.
One we know is not going to be is Lenny Curry, the Jacksonville mayor, who was being discussed quite a bit for that job, but he said recently that he is not, pursuing it. So, the CFO is a cabinet level officer. Some of the stuff they do is sort of low key behind the scenes CFO work.
Right.
But
it's kind of like if you're not hearing anything, it's all good.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. But when you're on the cabinet, you're pretty influential about land deals and a lot of other policy types of issues. So it's definitely a race to watch. And at this point, Ring is the only one who's really committed to it at this point.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Democratic side of the fence for the run for governor. You've got Mayor Gillum, who just made a pretty big speech last week, almost kind of set the tone, it appeared, for the rest of his campaign. And he's up against Gwen Graham, but it looks like Mayor Gillum's been knocking down some endorsements and kind of had a lot of activity. How's that race shaping up on the Democratic side?
Gillum is he's got a lot of connections with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and he's young and he's dynamic, and I think that's helping him get some of these endorsements. And you hate to. You hate to say, draw a lot of conclusions this early in a race, but I mean, he seems to be going for that sort of Bernie Sanders group of voters, progressive, younger, and he's got a lot of energy. One thing I thought was interesting in what he said last week was that, Democrats are not going to win by just camping out in South Florida. They have to run statewide races. And this has been a problem for them over the years. I mean, they do well in Broward, Palm Beach, and Dade County, and then they don't do well any other places. Now, they have started doing pretty well in Orlando, Osceola County, sort of in some of the Central Florida areas. But one of the things one of the points he made was this has to be a statewide race for Democrats, or they're going to wind up like the last two gubernatorial candidates, Charlie Crist and Alex Sink, who spent most of their time in South Florida, but just got drubbed in anywhere north of Orlando.
Well, and arguably, I mean, a Tallahassee guy, he's as close to the Panhandle as Gwen Graham's former seat was, and I think he's trying to make the argument that he knows the right people to make the case.
Well, I think I'm sure he's making that case. I do think Gwen Graham, part of the strangeness of this is that at this point, the two best-known Democratic candidates are both from Tallahassee.
Right.
So you don't have sort of the built-in geographic advantage that somebody from South Florida or Tampa.
Whereas Representative Graham, or Congresswoman Graham, has the Graham name.
She does, and I think it was also noticeable that when she announced her campaign, she announced it at a school in Miami-Dade County, where her father had done one of his work days, 30-some years ago.
Right.
So there's a lot of play there. I do think that she's going to have a lot of institutional support. We're already seeing some of that happening, and I think she'll have more money than Andrew Gillum will, unless he can just tap into that progressive network to get a lot of low or small dollar amounts and so on. I mean, Adam Putnam's sitting there raising money like crazy on the Republican side. Now, whether he'll have a challenger, we don't know at this point.
Right.
But there's names floating around, and but he's campaigning a lot and he's raising a lot of money. So he's a formidable candidate for anybody to run against.
As always, third largest state in the nation will be a big fight for the governor's seat. So, all right, well, Jim, thanks. That's all the time we have for today, but we will stay tuned for all of your briefs for the upcoming session to keep our listeners and viewers tuned in. So
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, that's all the time we have for today's Capital Dateline. Thanks for tuning in. But if you get a chance, hit us up on our Facebook page at Capital Dateline Online or connect with us on Twitter at the FCTA. Thanks for tuning in.